Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is May 28th, day 600 of the war. Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our military correspondent, Emanuel Fabian. Hi, Manny. Thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Amanda.
We are going to take a tour of the 7 fronts of the war and see where things stand on day 600. We'll start with Gaza, of course, head to Lebanon, move over to Syria, talk about the Houthis in Yemen, and also have a bit of Iraq and Iran, and also head to the West Bank. So all of this and more when we're back.
Jews have to learn to walk and chew gum at the same time. Thank you, Mr. President, for Jerusalem. No thank you for banning Arabs. His message on anti-Semitism is a good message. Trump is saying all the right things, and he may even be doing the right things, but for the wrong reasons. It's a dilemma for us, but I think we still have to stand up for the institutions, for due process, even if the wrong things that he's doing help us in the long term.
I just don't see how they help us at all, because I think in the long
Yehuda,
run,
there needs to be consequences. You can go out, you can march with a Palestinian flag. God bless you. That's fine. But if you use that flag to stop a Jewish students to go to class or beat them up, that's not freedom of speech. There needs to be consequences.
And we're back. Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our military correspondent, Emanuel Fabian. Today is day 600 in the war. And of course, the operation in Gaza is heading towards intensification as efforts to hammer out a hostage release ceasefire deal are basically failing, it appears, to all involved. So, Manny, let's talk about the war in general, but first of all, let's give a bit of an update on what happened yesterday in terms of the new humanitarian aid operation with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation that started up and is actually delivering food, but there are some, shall we call them, hiccups. Tell us what happened.
And there was a bit of chaos during yesterday's, the first day of actually trying to distribute that. I think there was a day before. There was some small starting distribution, but it wasn't as big, wasn't as large scale as we saw yesterday. According to GHF, the sort of the American company involved in this, they delivered around 8,000 boxes of food to Palestinians who arrived at 2 distribution sites that opened, both of them in the Rafah area. And according to them, each box feeds around 5 to 6 people for 3 to 4 days, which is, according to them, 462,000 meals. So it's quite a significant amount that they were able to do. But what we did see yesterday is at one point, thousands of Palestinians sort of rushed and overran the distribution site. Israeli officials and GHF have downplayed the incident. They said that the American security personnel there withdrew momentarily. They fired warning shots. And then some of they say a small amount of aid was then taken by the people rushing in, and then they resumed operations afterward, and saying that everything's fine. So it doesn't look good for that happening on the first day, but I think we will see. They'll resume these operations again. They'll launch the other 2 sites. The third one is in Rafah, and the fourth one is in the central Gaza area, which those haven't opened yet. But hopefully we'll see that this does play out well. Maybe they've learned sort of how to prevent such a thing from happening again. But I mean, it's almost impossible to predict. There's hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza who are evidently hungry for food at this point in the war, especially after aid has been stopped going into Gaza for the past 2 months or so. So it's going to be very difficult for them to actually carry this out in an orderly manner, but hopefully they've sort of learned of how to handle this in the future, because Israel wants this to become the sole source of aid entering Gaza without having to send in trucks that do get looted by Hamas and taken by Hamas and then sold back to the civilians.
Right. And in the meantime, the trucks are still meant to be operating, at least, but there are accusations from Kogat that aid is just piling up on the border. And the United Nations, for example, aid wing is not bringing out the trucks to pick it up. What do you know about this?
So, I mean, it's a fact that there are hundreds of truckloads of aid waiting on the Gazan side of Kerem Shalom. According to Kogat, it's 400 trucks worth. The way it works is that these trucks are screened at Kerem Shalom on the Israeli side. Then they enter the Gazan side, and then they're offloaded there into this logistics sort of center. And then on the other side, trucks need to come and pick up the aid and then bring them into the wherever they need to go to in Gaza. Now, Israel says, or Kogat's saying that the UN and the aid groups are not doing their job. They're failing to come. They're failing to collect the aid. And this isn't the first time we've had this. We've had this throughout the entire war, that hundreds of trucks are piling up on the Gazan side. But the UN is saying, and the aid groups are saying that they're not able to do it because of the insecurity, because of looting, because Israel's not coordinating with them, and they blame Israel for failing to establish safe routes for them to take the aid. I don't know who's right in this case. I think both sides are accusing each other, but in reality, the aid is piling up on the Gazan side and not reaching the Palestinians. You know, like out of the 600 aid trucks that have entered Gaza in the past week or so, 400 are waiting to be collected still. So really, we talk about every day how hundreds of trucks are entering Gaza, but most of it's not even reaching their destinations.
Also hearing reports about Hamas putting up roadblocks. Have you heard anything to confirm these reports?
So there were reports. There were some Palestinian reports as well, but this also came from GHF, the American company, that when they announced the sort of the opening of one of these aid distribution sites, there were efforts by Hamas to prevent people from actually reaching the facility, because Hamas, of course, wants to be the one involved in handing out the aid, or selling the aid more correctly. But I don't think it sort of Hamas managed to stop anybody from reaching, because we saw thousands of people reaching these aid distribution sites. So those efforts were apparently not very successful.
And we also saw on social media Hamas telling Gazans not to go to this humanitarian aid effort in order so that they're not, I don't know, collaborating with Israelis or Americans. Okay, let's put that to the side and let's talk about the war effort from the IDF side in Gaza. What has changed in the past several days since we last spoke?
So still we're at this point where the army still hasn't gone in all the way yet with its major offensive, but we did see the IDF announced that it started pushing into Khan Yunis, sort of next to Rafah. So one of the army's divisions, the 36th, that had established the Morag corridor, which we've spoken about before, has completed its operations in the Morag corridor and the Rafah area, and is now pushing into Khan Yunis. The 98th Division is also operating in that area, pushing into Khan Yunis. And then in North Gaza, we're seeing the 162nd Division pushing into sort of the East Gaza City neighborhoods. So Shaja'iyah and Tufah and Daraj, those areas, which the army didn't operate in. I guess in Daraj, Tufah didn't operate in as much during the war. Shaja'iyah, the army has been in many times, but the Tufah area, I think only once it was in there. So it's sort of a new area it now needs to clear. And there are ongoing operations in other areas. Still in Rafah, the army is clearing and searching for tunnels and demolishing tunnels. It's relatively slow paced right now. There is still fighting. There was a soldier who was seriously wounded in a sniper attack in North Gaza yesterday. So it's not without fighting, but definitely the pace is maybe slower than we would expect. But it really depends on how the hostage talks are going. We know that there are still some sort of talks ongoing, and when they do fail, or if they do fail, Israel will then announce that it is going forward with this major offensive where seizing 75% of the Gaza Strip's territory, which, like we've spoken before, will take the army 2 months to do.
Right. And just to remind our listeners, this is day 600 of the war. And throughout Israel, there are events marking this day from all sides of the political spectrum. And of course, the major push that you see on the streets is for the end of the war right now and the release of the hostages. So please check out our live blog to see how these events are unfolding throughout this day 600. Now, let's continue our tour and move to the West Bank, which until this Gaza war was the focus of most of the IDF operations. And even during much of the Gaza war was where most of the troops, many of the troops were stationed and are still stationed. So in the past several days, we've heard about operations to find banking systems that are funding terrorists and other operations of this type. What are you seeing in general right now in the West Bank through these 600 days of war?
I think the big worry for Israel on October 7th and the few days afterwards was this turning into a multi-front war, and it was right, I guess, because we saw attacks from all these other fronts, from Lebanon, from Iran, Iraq, and everything. But the West Bank was a huge concern for Israel because up until October 7th, there were these terror attacks almost every week. If you remember at the time, for about 2 years, there were just it was a series of terror attacks and dozens of Israelis were murdered. So it was a big concern for army officials in the West Bank that the West Bank would erupt into this another front, and it's a very difficult front to deal with because it's not like trying to guard a border or anything. It's a huge area, and there's Israeli civilians living in settlements there. But I think what we can say after 600 days of the war is that the West Bank has been mostly contained. There have been terror attacks, but definitely there's been a decline. And I spoke to army officials in the West Bank a few months ago, and they showed me the statistics, and it really does show that there has been a decline in Palestinian terror attacks. There has also been attacks by Israelis against Palestinians, but still they have occurred, but definitely not as frequently as maybe we saw at some other periods. And recently, the army's been carrying out these major operations in the West Bank refugee camp. So mainly in Jenin, in the Jenin refugee camp, and in Tulkarm, in both the Tulkarm camp and in Nur Shams, which is right adjacent to it. The army's been in those areas for the past 2-3 months or so, and they've all been cleared of all the people that live there, all the civilians, and of course all the terrorists that have sort of established themselves in these camps, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And there hasn't been much fighting in those areas, of course, because nobody's there, but the army has been demolishing a lot of homes in these areas. According to the army, it's mainly to establish routes that it will make it easier in the future for the army to operate through these areas, because they're very narrow, these refugee camps. So by demolishing homes, they're able to widen the roads, essentially. And it's gone through a whole process of appealing to the High Court, and because the people that live there, of course, don't want their homes destroyed. But that's a whole nother story. But the fact is that the army is essentially, for the foreseeable future, holding these refugee camps in the West Bank and not allowing anyone, not Hamas, but also not civilians, to return to them. And I think that's the main focus now. But it is still, I'm saying that the violence is relatively contained. We're not seeing daily terror attacks in the West Bank. There are attacks here and there. The latest operation, like you mentioned, is against money exchange stores. In a lot of cases, when Hamas wants to carry out an attack, it needs to fund the attack, it needs to buy the weapons, it needs to pay the operatives. And it usually does so through money exchange stores, because they have links abroad. They can send the money to the exchange store, and it's a pretty known sort of tactic that Hamas uses, not just in the West Bank, but in Gaza and other areas as well. So the army and police launched this operation yesterday, targeting these money exchange stores, shutting some of them down, arresting the owners, summoning them for investigation. Basically, those who are accused of trying to funnel money to Hamas or for Hamas in the West Bank.
Okay, in all of these operations in the West Bank, Manny, are you seeing cooperation with the Palestinian Authority, or is it Israel acting alone?
I think there's cooperation in some areas more than others. Jenin is sort of a good example, because there was an operation by the Palestinian Authority, and then the PA left, and then the army went in right after them, and then the army left and the PA went in again. So there's definitely more cooperation recently than in previous years, or I would say the PA is a bit stronger today, and it's able to actually exercise control in certain areas where it wasn't before. And I've spoken to IDF officials. They all say we need a strong Palestinian Authority. It makes our job a lot easier. If they can exercise control in these areas, it will mean that we don't have to. It's not that we shouldn't, and we don't need to rely on the PA, but it will definitely make things a lot easier if the PA is stronger and able to prevent Hamas from establishing itself in Jenin or in Nablus or in any other area. Because, of course, the PA isn't the best partner, but it's much better than having Hamas in these areas. Is at least is what the army is saying.
Okay, so on that note, let's turn to Syria, where a strong leader fell rather recently. And of course, there's a bit of a vacuum that has been filled by ex-terrorists or hopefully ex-terrorists. And so recently we're hearing reports that there's direct contact between Israel and Syria. And in recent weeks, they've held face-to-face meetings amid calming tensions and preventing conflicts. But of course, Israel is still inside Syria, which Israel occupied since the fall of the Assad regime. So give us a bit of a what's happening in terms of Syria in these 19 months of war as well.
So, up until the fall of the Assad regime, Israel was carrying out many strikes in Syria, and then once the Assad regime fell, the Israeli Air Force launched this very extensive operation to try and demolish all of the remaining weapons that belonged to the Assad regime. Very impressive 48-hour bombing campaign that basically eliminated all of the air defense systems, all the fighter jets, all the weapon stockpiles. And there were a few strikes here and there afterward as well, remaining infrastructure as the Jolani or Mohammad al-Shara's new government was sort of established. There were still strikes here and there that were being carried out against weapons or facilities that Israel feared could be used against Israel. But I will note that since I think earlier this month, there hasn't been any strikes in Syria, at least any reported strikes in Syria, which is interesting because it comes alongside these talks. And we've heard publicly from Syria, from Bashar, that they don't want peace with Israel, but they definitely want to avoid a war with Israel. They're not interested in war. And other officials in his government have said that they would like to have some sort of agreement with Israel to stop the sort of Israeli aggression on Syria, even though Israel sees it differently and sees that its strikes are preventing weapons that could harm Israel. So I think these talks are going in the right direction because we are seeing less and less Israeli strikes, but still the army is deployed to 9 posts still inside southern Syria, mostly within the buffer zone and some just slightly over. They are still operating in Syria, not too deep, up to 15 kilometers is what I've been told, with ground troops. And trying to find weapons that could be used against Israel. And also there are efforts, humanitarian efforts, to aid the Druze in southern Syria. There was this a few weeks of this violence between the Druze and other Syrians, or members of the new government. And the army has been evacuating wounded Syrian Druze to Israel for treatment. They've established a new sort of medical facility in southern Syria to treat the Druze. And there's been all sorts of efforts to try and help them. There was even a delegation of like hundreds of Druze that entered Israel to visit a site that's holy to the religion as well. It definitely looks like it's going more in the right direction now and sort of calming down there. But of course, anything can happen. And I don't think Israel really knows, or even the world really knows, what Syria is going to be like, and whether or not this new government is going to be stable and actually, if Syria is going to be stable for in the coming years.
Correct. And indeed, after the United States lifted sanctions on Syria, there was a outbreak of unrest there. And amid, of course, as you said, rumors of the Abraham Accords being enlarged to include Syria, there's a lot of pushback. So we don't really know what's going on there, but it sounds actually promising. So let's go to a short break.
What surprised you the most discovering about Jewish life in the United States?
I think it's the pride. I think I was envy of that pride. Just being proud, being a proud Jew. It's something that I never even contemplated. I was just an Israeli. I think the fact that, in Israel, we have all sort of sectors in society. You kind of grow up with your kind. I hate that. The fact that I don't know a lot about my Jewish life, and I need to go abroad just to understand that. It's something so messed up, and how we grew up here. It's just, I think, once it got political to be Jewish in Israel, it made me kind of push away from that. once I got to LA, once I got just being with my daughters abroad, just understanding what we are, my heritage, where we come from, our story, our values, took me a long time. Took me a long time to get there.
And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our military correspondent, Emanuel Fabian, and we're conducting a tour of the 7 fronts of the war that has broken out since October 7th on this, the 600th day of the war. So, Manny, we've gone through Gaza, we've gone through the West Bank, we've talked about Syria. Let's head to a very quick update about Iraq, which actually was and wasn't a factor during these 19 plus months of war. And most recently, what we're hearing is that there are negotiations to release Elizabeth Shurkov, who is the Israeli-Russian hostage that's been held there from even before the war broke out. Other than that, what are you hearing out of Iraq recently?
Not too much, to be honest. There were these Iran-backed Iraqi militias that were launching drones at Israel for a while, hundreds of drones. It's been nearly 6 months. For one reason or another, there was the ceasefire and other factors that played internally in Iraq that caused them basically to stop launching these drones and cruise missiles at Israel. But it could be a factor in the future, and the army is definitely still looking at Iraq because, right, at some point anything can happen and they may begin relaunching their drones again at Israel, like how the Houthis are still firing their missiles and drones at Israel.
So we were just talking about Iraq, but as we were speaking, we hear about the strike that Israel has just conducted on Yemen in light of the Houthis' ballistic missiles that are relentless, essentially. In the past 5 days, we've seen at least 5 missiles. And in the past, I don't know, several months, at least 40 is what I believe the figure is. So Manny, tell us about the reports of the strike that came in as we were recording just now.
So yeah, just as we're recording, Israeli Air Force fighter jets are striking the Sana'a International Airport again, I'll add. Earlier this month, Israel basically bombed and destroyed the airport and destroyed most of the planes there, but 11 days later, I wouldn't say reopened, but the Houthis managed to land a plane at the airport. They fixed the runway, but the terminal building is gone, the control tower is gone, everything's basically gone. This is what we're hearing right now. We'll, of course, get more details from the army later on. And, of course, this comes following almost daily Houthi missile attacks. And the Sana'a airport has been hit twice before, and other ports in Yemen have been hit before. But we're not seeing that this is actually really stopping the Houthis. I don't think this will also stop the Houthis. I think they're going to continue to fire their ballistic missiles at Israel, which has become somewhat of a nuisance. And of course, what they really aim to do there is to try and wake up as many Israelis as possible. It's less about trying to actually hit anything, because ultimately the vast majority of these missiles have been intercepted and not caused any major damage. I will note that in the last few days, the sort of the areas of alerts have actually been smaller than previously. So I think the Home Front Command is actually improving their system to basically alert less people, it's now down to, instead of millions of Israelis, it's several 100,000 instead. So just smaller areas of alerts, which is definitely, I think many people are quite thankful for that, for not having to wake up at 2, 3, 4 in the morning for these attacks.
For sure. And of course, the aim is this terrorism, the getting the people out of bed in the middle of the night, including, of course, New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman, who wrote about it in a recent column. So let's turn to Lebanon. And on November 27th, a temporary ceasefire that folded into a larger ceasefire that seems to be holding was struck. And in the meantime, Israel is still striking in Lebanon and holding at 5 different spots, outposts that it didn't hold before, of course. So what do you see happening here? Is the Lebanese force actually moving in and filling the vacuum that Hezbollah has left? Are we seeing a way that this is actually going to transition into some stability?
I think so. I've seen reports in the last couple of weeks of the Lebanese army operating in villages in South Lebanon, which were previously, I would say, off limits to Lebanese authorities because they were, Hezbollah strongholds. And in the past week, we've seen basically daily drone strikes on Hezbollah operatives. There was one last night. The army hasn't confirmed it yet, but we're seeing reports in Lebanon of a Hezbollah official or a Hezbollah member being killed in an Israeli drone strike in South Lebanon. The army confirmed one that it carried out earlier in the day. So I think since the beginning of the ceasefire in I think November, more than 150, maybe even 160 Hezbollah operatives have been killed thus far in Israeli strikes. And Hezbollah's not responding. I don't think they can respond because they know that Israel will, of course, escalate if they do. So it does seem like the ceasefire is going sort of according to plan. The Lebanese army is taking more control. And even Israel, because of its focus in Gaza, is drawing down some forces on the Lebanese border. The army still deployed in 5 points inside southern Lebanon for the foreseeable future. But it may indeed also withdraw from those at some point if indeed everything is, the ceasefire continues and stability is reached in that area.
Israel is super vigilant on that border, and you can see, of course, footage of drones policing the area all the time, and of course, even Israeli Air Force planes over the area conducting strikes, as we said. But there is a sense, at least my sense is, that Israel is not going to rely on these other forces. And I cannot, even if Israel does pull out of these 5 specific spots, I can't foresee a future in which Israel will not be hands-on here, just because of what happened since October 8th when Hezbollah joined the war and hugely destructive and fatal missile barrages were sent. So what do you see happening here? How can we walk this line of the ceasefire and still be really, really involved in the security of our people on the northern front?
I don't think anything's going to change there. I think Israel will have to remain vigilant and on heightened alert. I mean, the army's already changing its whole deployment on the Lebanese border. They're establishing dozens more army posts, one in front of every community, because there wasn't previously there. It's upgrading its border wall in the area still. It's changing quite a lot in that area, and I think that will remain for the foreseeable future, unless there's normalization and a peace agreement with Lebanon, which I'm not sure if we're close enough to that yet. But hopefully in the future, Israel can reach something like that.
Okay, so this is definitely a lesson learned from the war, from the invasion of Hamas. And I would say, arguably, these aren't part of the 7 fronts, but this lesson is being taken forward also with the border with Jordan and arguably perhaps even with Egypt, that more forces and more vigilance, and in the case of Jordan, a more permanent border is being built. Do you see these, Manny, do you see these as direct results of lessons learned from the Hamas invasion on October 7th?
100%. And army officials have said this repeatedly. Going into Syria and taking the posts on the other side of the border and going into Lebanon and holding those positions, it's all related to Israel's lessons from October 7th. And all the strikes we saw in Syria to remove all those strategic weapons and other sites that could be used against Israel it was part of these lessons that we've seen in a lot of the investigations. And all these army investigators have all said, Israel cannot allow a monster to grow on its border. It just can't allow that anymore. It can't allow something like Hamas. Even if we think it's contained and even if we think we can, strike it to weaken it, don't even allow it to grow in the first place is the sort of the message I've heard from a lot of people in the army following October 7th.
Okay, so now we're turning to the final and unknown front, which is Iran. And over the course of the war, of course, there have been, to put it in an understatement, tit-for-tat strikes between Iran and Israel. And there are reports coming out of the New York Times that U.S. officials are a bit worried that Israel will take matters in its own hands and complete another preemptive strike on Iran in light of the nuclear talks that are being held between the U.S. and Iran. So this is very much on the rumor level, but tell us a little bit about what has happened in these past 600 days in terms of Israel's conflict, with very overt conflict, which number one is obviously a new thing here, the overt conflict between Israel and Iran.
Right now, Iran, I mean, I'm not the diplomatic reporter here, so it's very hard for me to tell you what's going on behind the scenes with
Right. He's
a
on
nuclear
reserve
deal.
duty.
He's
Just
in,
to,
yes, right. So what I can say is that, from the military perspective, is that the strikes that Israel carried out against Iran in response to its ballistic missile attacks have put Iran in a bit of a difficult situation, where it's very exposed right now. Israel destroyed all its air defense sites, especially those defending its nuclear facilities. And Iran, at least this is what Israel thinks, is that Iran knows that if it launches another attack against Israel, the next response that Israel carries out is going to hit them quite a lot harder than the last one, because now all their sensitive facilities are exposed, their energy sites, their nuclear facilities. Even if Israel can't, bomb the underground sites, the next strike on Iran is going to hurt them a lot more than the last one did. That's what Israel thinks is going through Iran's mind right now. And we know, of course, Iran is trying to support its proxies again. The Houthis, of course, Hezbollah is trying to regroup and rearm again. And Iran, of course, is supporting them. And it really sort of, there's all these reports now on how Israel's preparing to strike Iran, maybe imminently. And I would say that for the past few years, Israel's been preparing for a strike in Iran against the facilities. That's not a secret or anything, but it really comes down now to these ongoing talks regarding a nuclear deal. I don't think that Israel would carry out a major strike on Iran's nuclear facilities without involving the US, not only just for support, but anyway, just letting them know, because they're involved in this whole region. So I don't think that there'll be any surprises, basically. I think the Americans will know when Israel, if it decides to carry out something major. But for now, I think Israel's quite happy with the situation, because Iran is somewhat deterred. It's involved in negotiations with the US, and doesn't look like it's going to launch any more ballistic missiles at Israel anytime soon. It planned to after Israel's last strike, and then it backed down from it, from what we understand, and decided not to in the end. So Israel's in a more powerful position now against Iran, but things could change. Iran may decide to go and launch an attack on Israel, even, and risking the response that Israel will carry out against them.
A lot of unknowns here. So, Mandy, thank you so much for taking us on this tour of the seven fronts on this 600th day of the war. And of course, we are all thinking about the hostages in Hamas captivity throughout these 600 days today. Mandy, thank you again for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another installment tomorrow. This episode was produced by the Podwaves and video edited by Thomas Gersh. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, shalom.